Hello everyone, welcome back to our channel. Today we invite you to delve into a haunting historical story where the line between holiness and evil becomes thinner than ever. For this tragedy proves that the greatest enemy is not outsiders, but one's own brother. Kidnapped by his own brothers, buried alive in a cramped latrine, and broken by torture, St. John of the Cross faced a darkness that should have destroyed him. But strangely, in that desperate darkness, instead of cursing, he wrote some of the greatest love poems in the history of Spanish literature. A free spirit in a captive body. Into a world of suffocating church luxury stepped John of the Cross. Born into abject poverty, small in stature but iron in spirit, he did not seek a career, he sought God. He found his true purpose with Teresa of Avila, launching the discalced reform. Together they traded soft leather shoes for bare feet and fine wool for rough habits, stripping away everything, status, warmth, and safety, until only God remained. John never preached against his more comfortable brothers. He simply existed. Yet, his existence became a silent, unbearable mirror. When the other friars saw his bleeding, frost-bitten toes and watched him fasting on bread and water, they did not see a saint. They saw their own spiritual failure. His humility humiliated their pride. Unable to rise to his moral standard, they decided to destroy the standard bearer. They convinced themselves that crushing this little rebel was necessary to save the order. By the autumn of 1577, John was a marked man. Branded a rebel and stripped of legal protection, he watched the spies circling his humble cottage in Avila. He was not naive. He knew the wolves were at the gate. Yet when friends urged him to flee to safety, John refused. He would not abandon the nuns he served. He chose to remain a sentinel at his post, waiting for the inevitable blow to fall, armed only with his silence and his faith. November passed into December. The Castilian winter arrived with his teeth bared. The plains around Avila turned brown and gray, and the winds howled off the mountains, rattling the shutters of John's humble dwelling. The sun set early on December 2nd, 1577. The city of Avila locked its gates. The narrow winding streets emptied as the cold descended. In his small cottage, John of the Cross finished his evening prayers. He was 35 years old, though his ascetic life made him look older. He wore the rough, patched habit of the Reform. His feet were bare against the cold floor. He had few possessions, a breviary, a Bible, a few papers, and a wooden cross. He blew out the candle. The darkness of the room was comforting to him, a space of intimacy with God. He lay down on his simple pallet, pulling a thin blanket over his shoulders. Outside, the wind whistled, masking the sound of footsteps approaching on the cobblestones. They did not come as a delegation. They came as a raiding party. A group of Carmelite friars, men of the cloth, accompanied by armed laymen and constables, surrounded the small house. They carried torches, cudgels, and hidden blades. Their breath steamed in the freezing air. There was no hesitation in their movements, no solemnity of religious duty. There was only the adrenaline of the hunt. These were men who had convinced themselves they were doing God's work. They told themselves they were restoring order. But underneath the pious justifications, there was the thrill of power. Tonight, the little friar who made them feel so small would be brought low. Tonight, the mirror would be shattered. One of the friars stepped forward to the heavy wooden door. He did not knock. He raised his foot and kicked. The sound of splintering wood shattered the silence of the night. It was the sound of a brotherhood breaking. It was the sound of the end of John's life as a free man and the beginning of his descent into the underworld. Inside, John sat up in the darkness, his heart pounding. He heard the rush of boots, the shouting of voices, the crash of overturned furniture. He did not reach for a weapon. He had none. He did not scream. He simply stood up, his hands open, and waited for his brothers to find him. The torchlight flooded the room, blinding him. Rough hands grabbed his habit. The sanctuary was violated. The dark night had officially begun. The violence of the arrest was not merely physical. It was a desecration. The sanctuary of the small cottage, which had been a fortress of silence and prayer, was now filled with the chaotic noise of shouting men and the smell of aggression. They fell upon the slight figure of the friar like a pack of wolves upon a wounded lamb. There was no dignity in the procedure, no reading of charges, only the crude efficiency of men who knew they were breaking the law of charity to enforce the law of power. They tore the rough habit of the reform from his body, the wool he had chosen for its coarseness, a symbol of his poverty, and forced him into the tailored, comfortable tunic of the Chalced observance. It was a psychological stripping, an attempt to erase his identity before they had even removed him from the room. By dressing him as one of them, they were not accepting him. They were mocking the very distinctiveness that defined his vocation. They bound his hands behind his back, the rough hemp biting into his wrists. Then came the blindfold. It was not a simple cloth, but a thick, suffocating bandage wound tight around his head, pressing against his eyes until the world was extinguished. In an instant, John was plunged into a premature night. He could hear their heavy breathing, smell the sweat of their excitement, and the oil of their torches. But he was alone in the dark. He was no longer Juan de Yepes. He was a package to be delivered, a problem to be disposed of. They dragged him out into the biting wind of the Castilian winter, forcing him onto a mule. He could sense the presence of the onlookers, the nuns of the Incarnation watching from behind their grilled windows, their hearts breaking in helpless terror as their spiritual father was swallowed by the shadows. The journey from Avila to Toledo is a distance of over 80 miles, a trek that takes days even in fair weather. In the dead of winter, it is a Via Dolorosa. For John, blindfolded and inadequately clothed, it was an extended torture. The landscape of Castile is unforgiving. High plateaus swept by winds that cut like knives, freezing rain that turns dirt roads into quagmires of mud and ice. He could not see the horizon. He could only feel the lurch of the mule, the sting of the sleet against his face, and the numbness creeping into his fingers and toes. He was disoriented, unaware of whether they were passing through a forest or skirting a cliff edge, entirely at the mercy of the men who despised him. But the physical suffering was secondary to the spiritual agony. The men riding beside him, cracking jokes and cursing the weather, were his brothers. They recited the same divine office. They had sworn the same vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Yet here they were, acting as his jailers. Every time the mule stumbled and he was jerked forward, he waited for a steadying hand, but none came, only rough shoves and commands to keep moving. He listened to their conversations. They did not speak of God or the holy mission of the order. They spoke of the trouble he had caused, the embarrassment of the reform, the satisfaction of finally silencing the little rebel. It was a betrayal that pierced deeper than any lance. To be hated by the world is the expectation of a saint. To be hated by one's own religious family is a crucifixion of the heart. They stopped at inns along the way, but John was not allowed to dine with them. He was kept apart, often locked in a stable or a back room, treated like a dangerous animal or a shameful secret. He ate scraps while he listened to the muffled sounds of his captors eating warm meals. In the darkness of his blindfold, the devil whispered to him. The temptation to despair was tangible. "Where is God in this?" the voice asked. "If you were truly doing his will, would he allow his priests to treat you this way? Perhaps you are wrong, Perhaps you are just a proud man who has led others astray. The silence of God was deafening, louder than the wind howling across the plains. After days of this freezing purgatory, the air changed. The smell of pine and snow gave way to the scent of ancient stone and river water. They had reached Toledo. The city, perched high on a granite gorge above the Tagus River, was the spiritual capital of Spain, a fortress of faith. But for John, it was a prison. He was led through the winding, labyrinthine streets, the sounds of the bustling city echoing off the walls until they reached the great Carmelite priory. It was a massive, imposing structure, a testament to the power and wealth of the order. He was dragged through the heavy gates, the iron hinges groaning shut behind him with a finality that made his heart sink. The blindfold was finally ripped away, but the light brought no relief. He found himself standing before a tribunal. The chapter of the friars had gathered to pass judgment. These were the dignitaries of the order, men of learning, status, and authority. They sat in judgment, their faces hard, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and disdain for the small, disheveled figure before them. They did not see a mystic. They saw a mess. They saw a man who had defied the decrees of Piacenza, a man who stubbornly clung to a way of life they had deemed illegal. The interrogation was brutal in its simplicity. They demanded that he renounce the reform. They offered him a way out if he would simply admit that he was wrong, if he would agree to wear shoes and live according to the mitigated rule, he would be forgiven. He would be given a comfortable cell, a position in the priory, and the respect due to a friar. They tempted him not with gold, but with normalcy. Come back to us, they seemed to say. Stop this madness. Be reasonable. It was the temptation of the Grand Inquisitor, the offer of bread in exchange for freedom. John stood before them, shivering from the cold and exhaustion, but his voice did not waver. He spoke with a quiet, maddening clarity. He explained that he answered to a higher authority than their decrees. He explained that the reform had been authorized by the papal nuncio, and that he could not, in good conscience, abandon the path God had marked out for him. He did not scream or argue. He simply refused to bend. And this refusal infuriated them more than any insult could have. It was the stubbornness of the martyr, the immovable rock against which their waves of authority crashed in vain. The verdict was swift and unanimous. He was declared a rebel, contumacious and incorrigible. The sentence was not merely imprisonment. It was a ritual of humiliation designed to break him completely. They stripped him of the habit he had been forced to wear, leaving him shivering in his undergarments. Then the punishment began, the circular discipline. The friars formed a circle around him in the refectory. The prior gave the signal. One by one, the brothers of Mount Carmel stepped forward. They held whips of leather and bundled rods. They did not strike him with the detached professionalism of an executioner. They struck him with the intimate anger of family. The lash whistled through the air and cracked against his bare shoulders. John gasped, his body jerking with the impact, but he did not cry out. Another blow, and another. The skin broke. Blood began to trickle down his back. The friars moved in a rhythmic procession, a liturgy of violence. Some struck harder than others, fueled by personal grievances or a twisted sense of righteousness. John knelt on the stone floor, his head bowed, accepting the blows. He tried to unite his suffering with the scourging of Christ at the pillar. He imagined the face of Jesus, bleeding and silent, but the pain was blinding. It was a fire that consumed his senses. His shoulders became a raw, bloody mess, the flesh torn and bruising purple. The physical agony was compounded by the shame of the public spectacle. These were the men he was supposed to love. These were the hands that held the Eucharist, now holding whips stained with his blood. When the discipline finally ended, John slumped to the floor, barely conscious. But the public humiliation was only the prelude. The true erasure was about to begin. There was no infirmary waiting for him, no good Samaritan to pour oil and wine into his wounds. Instead, they dragged him deeper into the priory, away from the guest rooms and the cloisters, into the bowels of the building. They brought him to a cramped, dark corner of the monastery, a space that had never been intended for human habitation. They opened a small, heavy door and shoved him inside. It was a closet, barely 6 feet wide and 10 feet long, originally built as a privy for the adjacent guest room. The ceiling sloped sharply following the line of the stairs so that in one corner John could not even stand upright. The floor was rough, cold wood. There was no bed, no chair, no table. The only light came from a slit in the wall, 3 fingers wide, high up near the ceiling, which looked out not onto the sky, but onto a dim corridor. So dim was the light that to read his breviary, John had to stand on a small, wobbly stool. He would balance there on tiptoe, stretching his aching body upward to catch the faint rays filtering in from the hallway. Even the act of prayer became a physical struggle, a desperate reach for illumination in a world designed to keep him in the dark. The door slammed shut. The key turned in the lock. The sound of footsteps faded away. John was left in absolute darkness. The air in the cell was stale, heavy with the phantom smells of its previous use and the damp chill of the stone walls. He crawled into the corner, trying to find a position that did not agonize his torn back. He curled up on the floor, shivering violently as the shock of the trauma set in. His body was on fire with pain, yet freezing cold. He was hungry, thirsty, and utterly alone. This was to be his world. He did not know it then, but he would not see the sun for 9 months. He would not see a human face that looked at him with kindness. He was buried alive in the heart of the Spanish Empire, a forgotten man in a stone tomb. The dark night was no longer a theological concept. It was the 4 walls pressing in on him. As the first hours of his imprisonment ticked by in the suffocating silence, John of the Cross closed his eyes and tried to pray, but the words would not come. There was only the throbbing of his wounds and the terrifying realization that his brothers had not just punished him, they had discarded him. But stone walls and iron bars were only the physical instruments of his torture. What lay ahead was not a matter of days or weeks, but a slow, grinding erasure of a human being. As the shock of the arrest faded, the true horror of his new reality set in. He was not merely a prisoner. He was a man buried alive. And in that suffocating dark, he would have to face not only the cruelty of men, but the terrifying silence of God himself. Time, in the dark, loses its shape. For John of the Cross, the calendar ceased to exist. There was only the cycle of the bells. He could hear them muffled through the stone walls, the great bells of Toledo ringing the Angelus, and closer the bells of the priory calling the friars to prayer. He knew the schedule of the house intimately. He knew when his brothers were chanting matins in the deep of night and when they were eating in the refectory. He was physically only yards away from them, separated by a few feet of masonry, but existentially, he was on another planet. He was a ghost haunting the foundations of their lives. His world had shrunk to a coffin-like box, roughly 6 feet by 10. Because it had been a privy, the floor was not merely cold, it was unclean. The stone walls sweated moisture. In the first months, the Castilian winter turned his cell into an icebox. He had no change of clothes. The tunic he wore, the mocked habit of the Chalced friars, was his only protection. He would curl into a tight ball on the floorboards, trying to trap his own body heat, shivering so violently that his teeth rattled in the silence. Frostbite gnawed at his toes, turning the skin necrotic and black. He learned to welcome the fever that came from infection because, for a few hours at least, it made him warm. But as the seasons turned, the torture inverted. Spring gave way to the relentless heat of the Spanish summer. Toledo sits on a rocky promontory, baking under the sun. The priory absorbed the heat, and the little closet with no ventilation became a kiln. The air grew heavy and thick. The stench of the drains, which had been dormant in the winter, rose up to suffocate him. It was the smell of human waste and stagnant water, a miasma that clung to his skin and hair. He struggled to breathe, gasping for air near the tiny crack in the wall high above his head, like a fish stranded on a bank. His body began to consume itself. The friars were intent on taming his rebellion through hunger. His daily ration was a pitiful crust of dry bread and a cup of water. Occasionally, as a gesture of charity, he was thrown a few sardines or scraps of salt fish, but these were often the refuse of the kitchen, fish that had turned, smelling of ammonia. Malnutrition stripped the flesh from his bones. He became skeletal, a walking cadaver with hollow eyes and translucent skin stretched tight over his ribs. Dysentery soon followed, a humiliating and draining illness that left him weak and soiled, with no means to wash himself. He was forced to relieve himself in a corner of his tiny cell, adding to the degradation. Then came the vermin. In the squalor of the cell, lice began to breed in his unwashed tunic. They were a torment that did not sleep. They swarmed over his emaciated body, biting and itching until his skin was raw. For a man who had always been fastidious and clean, this was a specific kind of hell. He felt like Job on his dunghill, scraped and sore, covered in worms, rotting while he was still alive. He was becoming less human by the day, descending into a feral state of survival. Yet, the most brutal punishment remained the weekly, circular discipline. Every Friday the door would screech open, and the light of a torch would blind him. He was dragged out, blinking and stumbling, to the refectory. There, the ritual of the whip continued, but as the months dragged on, the friar's attitude shifted. Initially, there had been anger. Now there was something worse, contempt. They looked at this filthy, stinking skeleton of a man and saw a stubborn fool. "Why don't you give up?" they would sneer as the lash cut into his scar tissue. "Teresa is eating partridge while you eat dirt. Renounce the reform, and you can have a bath and a bed tonight." It was a tempting offer. A warm bath, a clean sheet, a plate of hot soup. It would have been so easy to say the words. I was wrong. But John remained silent. He took the beating, wiped the blood from his eyes, and allowed himself to be thrown back into the dark. The physical torture was designed to break the body, but the psychological warfare was designed to kill the soul. The friars knew that John's strength came from his connection to Teresa of Avila and the belief that he was part of a holy movement. To break him, they had to sever that connection. The jailers began a campaign of calculated lies. They would stand outside his door, speaking loudly enough for him to hear, pretending to gossip. "It is a shame about the reform," one would say. "I heard that the nuncio has shut down all their houses." "Yes," another would reply. "And Teresa? She has obeyed. She has given up this nonsense and is living like a grand lady in Madrid now. She has forgotten all about Friar John." Then a jailer would enter his cell, looking at him with mock pity. "Father John," he would whisper, "why do you persist? You are the last one. The others have all recanted. You are suffering for a cause that is already dead. You are a martyr for a mistake." This was the poison that dripped into his ear day after day, abandoned, forgotten, delusional. The isolation was total. He had no news from the outside world. For all he knew, they were telling the truth. Perhaps Teresa had given up. Perhaps he really was just a proud, stubborn man rotting in a hole for his own vanity. This precipitated the true dark night of the soul. It was not merely depression, it was a spiritual vacuum. John felt that God himself had turned his back. In the darkness he prayed, but there was no answer, only the scratching of rats and the throbbing of his wounds. He felt suspended over an abyss of nothingness. The God he loved, the God for whom he had given up everything, seemed to have vanished. He was left with the terrifying thought, what if there is nothing out there? What if I am insane? And then something broke, but it was not John. When the external world is utterly stripped away, the human mind faces a terrifying choice: shatter into madness or expand into an infinite interior universe. John of the Cross stood at that precipice. He stared into the abyss of his own suffering, and instead of finding despair, he found space. He realized that his jailers could control his body. They could control the light, the food, and the temperature. They could lock the door, but they could not enter the castle of his soul. There was a vast secret garden inside him that they did not know existed, and they had no keys to its gates. Deprived of all sensory beauty, no sunsets, no music, no flowers, no human touch, John began to construct a world of overwhelming beauty within his own mind. He stopped looking for God in the rituals of the church or the comfort of community. He sought God in the naked center of his own being. In the midst of the stench of the latrine, he began to smell the fragrance of lilies. In the brutal cold of the Toledo winter, he began to feel the heat of the divine lover. He began to compose. He had no quill, no ink, no parchment. The friars had forbidden him these weapons, so he used the only tablet he had, his memory. He began to weave words together, finding a rhythm that matched the beating of his heart. He built stanzas, polishing them in the silence, repeating them hundreds of times until they were etched indelibly into his brain. And what did he write about? Did he write a lamentation about the cruelty of his brothers? Did he write a treatise on the injustice of the Chalced friars? Did he write a dark, angry poem about the misery of prison? No, he wrote the spiritual canticle. He wrote one of the most intensely erotic, luminous, and joyful love poems ever composed in human language. Where have you hidden, beloved, and left me moaning? You fled like the stag after wounding me. I went out calling you, but you were gone. In his mind, the dark, cramping cell dissolved. He was running through thickets and forests planted by the hand of the beloved. He was climbing green mountains. He was drinking from resounding rivers. He used the imagery of the Song of Songs, describing the soul as a bride searching desperately for her bridegroom. The contrast is shattering. A man covered in lice, crouching in his own filth, was composing verses about the supper that refreshes and deepens love. A man whose back was a map of scars was writing about the gentle touch of God that tastes of eternal life. He composed 30 stanzas in that hole. He memorized them. He recited them to himself in the middle of the night to keep the madness at bay. The poetry was his lifeline. It was his rebellion. Every stanza was a victory over his captors. They wanted to turn him into an animal, but through his art, he was becoming an angel. They wanted to lock him in a closet, but he was roaming the galaxies of God's love. 8 months into his imprisonment, a small crack appeared in the wall of his isolation, not a physical one, but a human one. The severe jailer was replaced by a younger friar, a man from Valladolid who had recently arrived in Toledo. This new jailer was not blinded by the politics of the priory. He looked at John, and he did not see a dangerous rebel. He saw a dying human being. He was moved by pity. Tentatively risking his own punishment, he began to offer small mercies. He left the door open for a few minutes while he cleaned the corridor. allowing John a breath of fresher air. He brought him an extra piece of bread. One day, sensing the change in the guard, John asked for a favor. He did not ask for food. He did not ask for a blanket. He asked for a needle and thread to repair his tattered tunic, and he asked for paper and ink. The jailer hesitated. Giving a prisoner writing materials was strictly forbidden. It was an act of treason against the prior. But looking into the calm, luminous eyes of the prisoner, the young friar relented. He smuggled in a small stack of paper and a pot of ink. For the first time, John could pour the contents of his mind onto the page. He wrote feverishly. He transcribed the poems he had carried in his head for months. He wrote the romance of the gospel. He wrote the stanzas of the canticle. He hid the papers under the loose floorboards of his cell, guarding them with his life. These scraps of paper were more valuable to him than food. They were the proof that he was still alive, still thinking, still loving. But as August arrived, bringing the suffocating heat of the dog days, John knew his time was running out. The pity of the new jailer was a gift, but it could not save his life. His body was failing. He could feel his heart fluttering like a trapped bird. He was coughing up blood. If he spent another winter in the stone box, he would be dead. The Virgin Mary, to whom he had prayed every hour of his confinement, seemed to whisper to him in the heat of the Assumption Vigil. The message was clear. The poetry was finished. The time for endurance was over. It was time for action. However, inspiration is not liberation. Between John and his freedom stood a heavy oak door and a sheer drop into a deadly abyss. The poetry was finished. Now the thriller began. The decision to escape was not merely a choice of survival. It was an act of spiritual defiance. John knew that his body was reaching its absolute limit. To stay was to die, and while he did not fear death, he felt a profound mystical certainty that his work was not yet finished. The Virgin Mary, whom he believed had visited him in the fevered dreams of the Assumption Vigil, had not promised him a miracle of teleportation. She had promised him the strength to act. The miracle would not be the opening of the doors by angels, but the summoning of courage from a broken man to open them himself. The mechanics of the escape required a patience that bordered on the superhuman. During the brief periods when his new, more lenient jailer allowed him out of the cell to empty his waste bucket, John had been studying the door. It was a heavy wooden structure, locked from the outside with a padlock, but secured to the frame by a padlock hasp held in place by screws. He realized that the screws were old and the wood was rotting in the humidity of the summer. When the jailer was distracted, or when the noise of the priory was loud enough to mask the sound, John would work at the screws with his fingernails, and later perhaps with a loose nail he had found. Day by day, millimeter by millimeter, he loosened the iron hold that kept him buried. It was a race against time and weakness. Every turn of the screw required an expenditure of energy he did not have, leaving him trembling and breathless, terrified that a guard would notice the loose fixture. He prepared his equipment with the same meticulous desperation. He took the 2 meager blankets he had been given, filthy, threadbare things that smelled of illness, and tore them into strips. He knotted the strips together to form a rope. He tested its strength, pulling it taut with his frail arms. It was a fragile lifeline, likely too short to reach the ground from the soaring walls of the priory, which was built like a fortress on the cliff edge of the Tagus River. But it was all he had. He hid the rope and the loose screws under the floorboards, along with the precious handwritten poems, and waited for the moonless dark. The night of August 16th, 1578 arrived. The priory was silent. The friars were asleep in their cells. The only sound was the rhythmic breathing of the jailer sleeping in the adjacent quarter. John waited until the deepest part of the night, when sleep is heaviest. He stood up in his cell, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was the moment. If he failed, if the door creaked too loudly, if the jailer woke, the punishment would be unimaginable. He would likely be beaten to death or thrown into an even deeper dungeon to rot in chains. He pushed against the door. The loosened screws gave way. The hasp fell. The door swung open with a groan that sounded to John's heightened senses like a cannon blast. He froze, holding his breath, waiting for the shout of alarm, but silence held. The jailer did not stir. John stepped out of the cell for the first time in 9 months, not as a prisoner being dragged to punishment, but as a free agent. He was a ghost moving through the house of his enemies. He crept past the sleeping guard, stepping over his body with the lightness of a shadow. He carried his shoes in his hand to silence his steps, his bare feet making no sound on the cold stone. He reached the gallery that overlooked the city walls. He located a window that looked out over the steep embankment leading down to the river. Below him lay the abyss of the night. He could not see the ground. He could only hear the rushing of the Tagus River far below, a sound that was both terrifying and beckoning. He tied one end of his makeshift rope to a heavy iron ring embedded in the wall, likely a bracket for a torch or a banner. He threw the other end out into the void. He climbed onto the ledge. The wind caught his tunic, chilling his sweat-soaked skin. He looked back one last time at the prison that had tried to consume him. Then he swung his legs over the side and lowered himself into the darkness. The descent was a nightmare of physics. John was weak, his muscles atrophied from months of immobility. As he hung from the rope, the rough wool cutting into his hands, his arms screamed in protest. He lowered himself hand over hand, his feet searching for purchase on the rough masonry of the fortress wall. Then the rope ended. He dangled there, suspended in nothingness. He kicked his feet, searching for the ground, but there was only air. He was stranded. He looked down, but the darkness was absolute. He could be 3 feet from the ground, or he could be 30. If he dropped and broke a leg, he would be found in the morning and dragged back. If he fell from a great height, he would die on the rocks. He had no choice. His grip was failing. He whispered a prayer, entrusting his soul to the God who had sustained him in the dark, and he let go. He fell. The drop was indeed significant, terrifyingly long, but he did not shatter against jagged rocks. He landed in a pile of rubble and soft earth at the base of the wall, tumbling over himself, stunned and winded, but miraculously unbroken. He lay there for a moment, staring up at the stars, the vast glittering canopy of the Castilian sky that he had not seen for nearly a year. The air tasted sweet, lacking the metallic tang of the latrine. He was bruised, bleeding, and exhausted, but he was free. However, the danger was far from over. He was now a fugitive in a walled city. He was inside the courtyard of a convent that adjoined the priory, but the gates were locked. He was trapped in an enclosure, and dawn was approaching. If the sun rose, he would be spotted. He found a low wall bordering the street, and summoning a reserve of strength born of pure adrenaline, he scrambled over it using a stone as a step. He landed in the street. Now began the hunt. John knew that as soon as his escape was discovered, the alarm would be raised. The Chalced friars would scour the city. They would send men to the gates. He needed sanctuary immediately. He could not go to a hospital. He could not go to a public church. He made his way through the winding, labyrinthine streets of Toledo, sticking to the shadows, a ragged specter avoiding the night watchman. He headed for the only place he knew he would be safe, the convent of the discalced nuns of Toledo. When dawn broke, a terrifying figure stood at the convent door, filthy, blood-stained, and looking like a madman. But when he whispered his name, the nuns pulled him inside, protecting their spiritual father with a wall of silence against the pursuers who hunted him. Safe at last, John did not speak of revenge. He did not curse his torturers. Instead, he pulled crumpled scraps of paper from his tattered tunic and read the spiritual canticle. The nuns listened in awe as the voice, silenced for 9 months, sang of green valleys and overwhelming love. The dungeon had not destroyed him. It had distilled him. It crushed the grape, but produced the finest wine. John lived 13 more years, writing his masterpieces like the dark night of the soul. He never spoke ill of his jailers, viewing them not as enemies, but as instruments used by God to chip away his ego, leaving only the pure diamond of the soul. He taught the world that the dark night, the feeling of God's absence, is actually a sign of his purifying presence. Today, the powerful men who imprisoned him are forgotten dust, but the little man they threw into a latrine towers over history. We leave him not as a victim, but as a victor descending into the night. He shows us that while the night is dark, the flame of love is brighter still, and the darkness will never overcome it. St. John of the Cross proved that even in the deepest silence, the human spirit can still sing. But history is filled with other voices that were locked away, other souls who found light in the darkest of places. Is there another figure, a mystic, a royal, or a misunderstood outcast whose story has been buried by time? Someone whose life demands to be re-examined with this level of depth? Please, share their names with us in the comments below. We read every suggestion. And if this story touched something in you, if you believe that these narratives of resilience deserve to be brought out of the shadows, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Your support is the key that allows us to unlock the archives and bring these forgotten truths back into the light. Thank you for watching, and until next time.